So much. Awesome. Okay, everyone, we're just going to wait until we hit 11:30 Eastern exactly, and then we'll start.
Huda, should I go ahead and disable the waiting room just so that people come in automatically?
Yes, please. I was just looking for the controls.
That's amazing. I didn't know that we could do that.
I learned that 2 days ago.
All the Zoom. This is really what the conference is about, is all learning Zoom. Okay. All right, everyone, we're at time. Thank you for coming to this session. I've got a slide up with some good links for you if you've already not seen them. I think you probably have seen them multiple times. There's also pinned on our conference channels, so you can always get to these slides when you need to. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Theodore Gerontakis, Head of Metadata and Cataloging Initiatives at the University of Washington, and they will be talking about another inquiry into linked data IRI. So I will go ahead and stop sharing, and Theodore, you could take it away.
Okay, that should do it, right? Am I there?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna. This was originally conceived as another inquiry into linked data IRIs. I'm not sure if it really is an inquiry after all. It's more like an appreciation of people who design IRIs. But whoops, how do I advance my slide? There we go. Okay, so if it's an inquiry, then it's a pretty plain and simple inquiry in the respect that it doesn't offer any new solutions, but it's mostly how to implement existing standards and best practices, and pretty old ones at that. I'm going to whip through this pretty quickly due to time constraints, and I want to make it clear that when I use interchangeably the terms URI and IRI. For this talk, they mean exactly the same thing, although they aren't necessarily the same thing. So I'm going to identify two types of IRI problems. There's IRI problems for IRI owners and IRI problems for IRI consumers. And the owners are creators and publishers of linked data who formulate original IRIs, and the consumers are those who use or consume IRIs and have to interpret the IRIs. So the owners, this idea of ownership comes from the 2004 W3C publication on World Wide Web architecture, which I think is still a pertinent document. Well, it is, not I think, it is. That's URI ownership is the ownership relation between a URI and a social entity. So in that document, we know there are three pillars of web architecture. There's, and we're concerned with the identification pillar. And there's a central event in identification, that's allocation of an IRI, which is associating an IRI with a resource, and that's the responsibility of the owner. So I think IRI allocation is pretty tricky. There's lots of documents, and it's in lots of places. And as Tim Berners-Lee said in 1998, 25 years ago, what? Design a URI? I have to design URIs? Well, yes, you have to think about it. And that's true. But the good news is that it's IRI allocation for linked data. And we know from the linked data design principles that number two, we use HTTP URIs. And that's a good thing because there's about 300 registered URI schemes, and HTTP and HTTPS are the two that we use, and that narrows it down quite a bit. So we have to start somewhere with this design process. So why not start with URI syntax? That's specified in the request for comments, the IETF RFC 3986, published in 2005. We read that, we spend the day reading that, and then we find out it's not quite enough. We have to go to something else because it's a general syntax only. We need to get to the specific URI scheme to get further details. And that would be the HTTP protocol, which has been multi-volume since 2014. The one that we're interested in is RFC 7230, which is also syntax issues. And so we can break it down. We all know URIs very well. The breakdown is that first you start with the scheme name, HTTP, the colon indicates the end of the scheme name, you have a double / and that starts the authority component. The authority component is a host plus an optional port number, which is preceded by a colon. HTTP requires a host in the authority component, and the host is a registered name. It's always a registered name. It's usually a DNS name. It can be an IP address. What comes after that component is the path component following the authority component. That's delimited by a /. It's hierarchical. It's what distinguishes resources owned by the same owner. It's, it's a path. It's a path to a file usually. And it's what often gets the most attention in URI design. Like if you look at the Dodds-Davis linked data design patterns, chapter 2, identification patterns, it's almost all about how to make the most of your authority component. I mean, your path component, sorry. So here's a basic IRI on top of this slide. It ends at the path. After the path, there's only two things you can do. It's either a query with a question mark delimiter, or it's going to be a fragment with a fragment delimiter. So here are three examples. You can see we have the scheme, HTTPS, and the authority component and the path. Here's the scheme. DOI is the authority component, then followed by a path and a fragment in the second one. And the third one, scheme, authority component, a very short path, and then a query. So things we've seen all the time, but do we know what the components are? HTTPS is a little different than HTTP, but only as far as I understand it, I could be wrong about this, is that the main difference is that it's the TCP port, the optional port and authority component needs to be able to establish a TLS connection. So, and also the default port for HTTPS is 443, whereas for HTTP it's 80. So now we know everything we need to design IRIs, but not quite. I would recommend we take a deeper dive into web architecture because what we took is very shallow, and also look at the semantic and ontological context. So approach web architecture with some examples, some data creation. Let's say we're producing an RDF vocabulary, and we want to publish a static linked data set. It's meant for downloads. We don't have much technical infrastructure, so we can't have content negotiation. We can't have redirects. So that really limits us. In fact, that changes the IRI design, because we're going to go ahead and use hash IRIs instead. There's no redirects, right? But I'm not going to address that today. But that also affects your technological infrastructure, can affect your IRI design. And then we're going to also offer multiple serializations, which I don't think affects the IRI design at all. Anyway, we're going to create this is a SCOS vocabulary we're creating. It's a list of SCOS concepts, so it's simple knowledge organization system. And the list of concepts as a totality is an instance of a SCOS concept scheme. Our IRI allocation task is to assign an IRI to each concept. An example of a concept in this imaginary, it's actually a real vocabulary, but let's call it imaginary, is collective biography would be the label. So this was a value originally intended to be used as a coded value in Mark 008 field, position 34 for books, collective biography. So we go ahead and we describe it. The concept as a concept, this is just a bunch of assertions about this concept. I want to focus on we'll return to this. I want to focus on the IRI. So our IRI is a fragment IRI, right? It's got a fragment in it. So that means, according to the language of RFC 3986, we have a URI that identifies a primary resource up to the fragment, and within that is a secondary resource. So the primary resource in our case is the full concept scheme, and the secondary resource is the specific concept. So going back to web architecture, or more precisely semantic web architecture, which is something that's most often discussed by the W3C technical architecture group, whose work we probably know mostly through the document Cool URIs for the Semantic Web, which summarizes an influential decision made by the W3C TAG, Technical Architecture Group, released in 2008. So let's take a dive into web architecture with this document that we all know pretty well. So Cool URIs for the Semantic Web is an implementation of the W3C TAG solution to HTTP range 14. And basically it distinguishes between a web document and a real world object. So the name HTTP 14, it sounds cool, but well, it's an issue. It's an issue. It's an issue opened by the W3C TAG in 2002, supposedly resolved 2005. It was discussed pretty intensely through 2013, and it's still stalking us to this day. The title of the issue was, "What is the range of the HTTP dereference functions?" Issue number 14. So it's like a GitHub issue. So HTTP range 14, that kind of explains the name. So So it distinguishes is how do we distinguish URIs for web documents versus URIs for things that are not web documents. And of course, we all know the solution is either you have 303 redirects or you have hash URIs. I'm not going to go into that, but that's a well-known solution to the problem. So our cool URI for our concept is a hash URI in the parlance of cool URIs. It's an HTTP URI with a fragment. And so it's a semantic web hash URI, right? So that worries me a little bit because and I was the person who created the IRI. I'm thinking, well, I think we might have an uncool URI here. So I'm wondering, I'm scratching my head, why did we use that URI to start with? Well, it seemed like the easiest thing because we were doing static link data. So just we read the syntax on how to do a URI, just slap a URI in the thing and let's move on. But then we read the cool URIs document. We see requirement number 2 for cool URIs is be unambiguous. That is as to whether a URI identifies a web resource or a real world object. And now we sit back and we say, well, wait a minute, that's a web resource record, that's a document, and hash URIs are for RWOs. So it looks like I messed up the IRI. I messed it up. I messed up the IRI. And so just stay calm. Say, it's not prohibited that web documents can actually be fragments in other web documents. And as a matter of fact, if you think of the fragment, isn't that the reason that the most frequent use of it anyway? If you think of the fragment, it almost always retrieves an HTML document, and then the browser navigates to the anchor in the HTML document that matches the fragment, right? So that it is ambiguous. It is ambiguous when you use a hash IRI. Nevertheless, we got scared. You saw we were pretty scared there for a little while, and we remodeled our concepts from web documents to RWOs. I'll talk about that a little later. It's a little controversial, but let's continue with this URI design because we're about halfway there. We looked at URI syntax. We looked a little bit at web architecture through the cool URIs document, but there's still more to consider. I would say semantics and ontological context needs to be considered. So as the creators, we're creating a SCOS vocabulary, so our ontological context would be SCOS, the SCOS specification. And we're creating these values for use, for a particular use. We're going to use our own IRIs and we're going to consume them. And we're going to do that in an RDA, RDF environment. So we also want to consider the RDA context. So, okay, with the owners again, let's go ahead and look at SCOS concept because that's what we're giving IRIs to, is the concept. So what is a SCOS concept? Well, we spend the afternoon reading that specification to find out that it's really undefined. It's something subjective. SCOS doesn't want to overspecify. However, there are clues. There are clues all over the SCOS reference. For example, a SCOS concept is useful when describing the conceptual or intellectual structure of a knowledge organization system, and when referring to specific ideas or meanings established within a KOS. So doesn't that sound kind of internal and self-referential and documentary in nature? Well, I think so. So we're feeling pretty good at this point. We use the SCOS concept sensibly. We modeled them as web documents, and that seems correct at this point. In SCOS, there's no URI requirement, so we can lean back in our chair again and ask the cool URI question. Is a SCOS concept a web document or an RWO? And if it is an RWO, we have URI recommendations to follow. So we discuss it at great length and we decide, well, you can do either because SCOS doesn't determine that. SCOS only suggests what a concept is, so we can choose. But there are other clues. I don't want to say we did this, but there are other clues that SCOS is really intended to describe web documents, that is documentary in nature. Like, for example, in section 1.3, note that these are facts about the thesaurus or classification scheme itself, such as concept X has preferred label Y and is part of thesaurus Z. These are not facts about the way the world is arranged. That suggests pretty clearly that we're not talking about the concept in the real world, but the concept in a document. And that document is the concept description is in a document, right? A concept scheme. So, well, greater minds than mine have either had confusion or spread confusion. It's not only in our profession, but it's definitely in our profession. There's a lot of confusion about this still. For example, RDA modeled SCOS concepts in their value vocabularies as real world objects. So in the PCC initiatives and the URIs and MARC initiatives interpreted the values differently. They interpreted them as web documents. This would be a great talk to discuss this disagreement. All I'm going to say is that this is a disagreement that persists into the present, and that this is an illustration that these are real problems. I'm not just talking because I like to talk. I mean, these are real problems. So back to the SCOS concept. SCOS allows us to model concepts as RWO as a web document. So we talked, we're going to talk and consider, why don't we model our concepts as real world objects? And how do we do that? Well, can we do that by just avoiding assertions that in no way can apply to the real world concept? Well, maybe. We'll come back to that. Now the IRI consumer, because we created the RDF vocabulary for use in the RDF data set. So that would look like this. Here's what we're expecting. Here's the subject of the here's a triple. The subject of the triple is an RDA work. The predicate is an RDA property, which is a RDAW P10004, has category of work. And then here's our IRI for the concept, right? So that's pretty much, that's our RDA context briefly described, right? So does the RDA context require anything of our IRI values? Well, yes, it does. If we look at the description of has category of work, if we are recording an IRI, we have one option, which is record an IRI for a term or concept as a real world object selected from an appropriate vocabulary encoding scheme. So again, here comes the IRI anxiety. SCOS concepts, our SCOS concepts were modeled as web documents. Can we use those? Can we use those for value is in P10004? So well, why don't we just go to RDA and look at what do they mean by an RWO? So I'll extract from that what the glossary says. It's a term from a vocabulary encoding scheme referenced by an IRI. So that and other things too, but sounds to me like if there's an IRI, there's an RWO. I think that's the RDA way, and that's another talk, right? That's definitely something worth talking about. So, in summation, I think RDA seems unconcerned with web documents versus RWO distinctions. And you know what? Good, because web documents and RWOs really don't have anything to do with modeling information resources. The one thing I wonder, though, is why in RDA did they use the term real world object? Why did they have to use that troubled phrase from a troubled discourse? But they did it, and it causes trouble. It is a frequent instruction in RDA. Record an IRI for a term or concept as a real world object. So that we meet again and we say, well, what IRI is fit for RDA? In this case, would our concepts as web documents be inappropriate as RDA values? Again, expanding this into something bigger, what about concepts in id.loc.gov? They're a dual type, the SCOS concept and MAS RDF authority, which are many. Can these masquerade as RDA, RWO values? I think the answer is sometimes, but usually not. So in our project, with the subfield zeros in an RDA context, we're just throwing them away most of the times. So back to the IRI owner, because we just examined the RDA context, which is a known use case for our concepts. And that use case context alters the URI design in our case. So here's another place where we can change our URI, something else that can determine our URI design. Okay, remember, we looked at the cool URIs document. We decided that if we're using hash URIs, it should be for RWOs. Now we've added that RDA prefers IRI values modeled as RWOs. So we had better do something. So how about we magically create RWOs from our web documents? So remember what we decided to do? We said we were just going to get rid of anything that can't possibly be said about the real world concept, the real collective biography in the world, right? So all these things probably can be said. I mean, think about me. I'm a real world object. I can be in a scheme. Why not? I can have a notation. Why not? But this history note, this cannot be said about the concept in the real world. And this concept in the real world was not created in 2023. So we take those off. And do we have a real world object? Well, we said yes, we have a real world object. Okay, anyway. So the method. So what's the method? So what method is being proposed here? So we're for allocating IRIs. Know the syntax of IRIs. understand the issues of identification and web architecture, and determine if the IRIs are fit for their anticipated ontological environment. That's what we do here. So there's still all these 15-year-old questions though that plague us though, and I haven't seen a good answer to HTTP range 14, for example. So you know, oftentimes we wonder, well, what about our class of property definitions or ontologies? That's not enough. I mean, we know that every single thing that we retrieve on the web has to be a web document without exception. I'm sure somebody knows an exception, but almost every single thing is going to be a web document. Are the only ways to determine if the web document describes an RWO is if there's a 303 redirect, or if the IRIs are modeled as hash IRIs. Not only do I think not, but those are not even those are ambiguous. If it's a 303 redirect, it could be for many reasons. And if it's a hash IRI, it could be for many reasons. So there was a thing Jenny Tennyson wrote in 2011, I'll extract from that, is URIs will be used in ambiguous ways. We need to work out how to cope. And this seems like really good advice to me. In the meantime, as for me, I am going to remain old-fashioned and orthodox when allocating IRIs. And I'll try to run our entities through that binary model where there's two things in the world, web documents and RWOs. But I've only considered IRIs for SCOS concepts. I didn't even consider more complicated entities like IRIs for RDA entities. Like, well, what's an item? What's a nomen? So anyway, let's go back to the consumer one more time, because we left off interpreting IRIs using ontologies. It's difficult but necessary. We further interpreted through the cool URIs document versus RWO. I can't leave the question of consumption of IRIs without addressing Mark 0 and 1, because Mark 0 and 1 has almost duplicated the cool URI problem, almost, but not quite. Subfield 1 accords almost exactly with the W3C tag version of an RWO, but subfield 0 doesn't. The Mark spec says it identifies a name or label, and that is just not right. That is just not right. And here's a corrective from the PCC's Linked Data Advisory Committee. It is not a name or label as being identified, but in the case of Library of Congress subject headings, for example, it's an entry in a full-fledged KOS. So an entry in a full-fledged KOS as something that can be directly returned over HTTP with a 200 response code, right? It's a web document, right? So the description of subfield 0 in the Mark specification could use an edit because it has caused some trouble with that RDA RSC versus PCC issue. It was circulated around this problem. So my final word, we've explored the orthodox approach to allocating IRIs. We've explored the question of interpreting IRIs when consuming data. We know that there are fine messes ahead. We probably can't specify them out of existence. As for HTTP range 14, people got sick of this discussion 10 years ago, but still it continues to haunt us. And even when we just want to allocate IRI, well, it's about IRIs. So, but certainly when we want to allocate IRIs, and that's all I'm going to say today. I did make a bibliography of all the things I referenced. And the slides are posted, and there's also a chronology at the end of things that I think are events since 1991 that apply to IRIs. It's very sloppy, it's very partial, it's just for fun. So there we go. I think I can stop sharing. And whoop, my video went up. Sorry, my video went out. I didn't realize it. Okay, well, I'm still here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Theo, for that presentation. I'll admit I was trying to follow along, but I feel like real world objects in general make my head I was going to say split in half, but that may be a bit too much. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how I, for one, had never really considered all of the semantics behind the hashes and the distinction between, is this a web document or is this a real world object? And then I think where we landed is that you went through all that and ended up with a concept that you said identifies, is a web document that represents a real world object. Did I get that correctly?
The concept scheme as a totality is a document that contains descriptions of real world objects.
Okay, so that's why for an individual concept, you wanted to make sure you didn't have any terms in there that you could not identify or you could not say about the real world object that was being referenced.
Exactly.
So we do have some
We finally have a question in Slack.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think everyone's sort of fried at the end of this, and but there's furious typing going on. And the first one that's come up says, does class membership here help? Does class membership help here at all, or can it? For example, if we know that Theo's IRI, a FOF person, do we know that Theo is an RWO? I'll put that in the chat and so that you can look at that in case it's hard to read curly braces in it's hard to read curly braces out loud. So that's your first question, Theo.
Yeah, that's like my question, right? I mean, we go to the trouble of creating these classes, and we have instances of the classes. If we have good semantics in our ontologies, isn't that sufficient to determine what it is, what the thing is? And I think that's the RDA way. I think this is still something we're trying to figure out, but yeah, I think so. I think yes, I think it does help very much.
Thanks. So Joe Sarah asks, how do we bridge the gap where most LD conversations, subfield zeros specifically, seem to get bumped by the MARC crowd because people feel not qualified to make decisions about MARC as it relates to linked data?
What do we do about it?
How do we bridge that gap?
How do we bridge the gap? I mean, we in some cases we can, right? I mean, it's a really mixed crowd, a very, very diverse crowd of people that's working on this. We've got some people that are well versed in it, and some people that aren't. And the people that are, like in the PCC, like I'm in the PCC, I'm with a number of groups that are working on this. We work on disseminating information about MARC zeros and ones. There's been a lot of documentation about it. I don't think we're at a point where it should be being pushed aside. I think it's fair to expect users of MARC to understand zeros and ones, but it was all done in a pilot for a couple of years, and the pilot is now over. So now it's going to be opened up for broad use for people outside the pilot to enter zeros and ones in MARC records, and maybe that'll change the landscape. Maybe that will bridge the gap when catalogers at large are loosed on the world to enter zeros and ones. I'm not very big on that manual entry of zeros and ones. I think that's in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases, it's a waste of time. It's something that can be done automatically. I mean, there are cases. So I don't know if it's going to bridge the gap, because I don't even know if it's worth our effort to sit there manually typing in IRIs and zeros and ones. But so that's a long answer to basically say, oh, I don't know.
Thank you for the attempt. That's wonderful. I am checking if there are more questions, but I think the only other thing that is phrased as a question is Joe Sarah's other question, which is, how cool is this IRI talk? And he answers it himself by saying, so cool. There is some typing going on, so maybe we take a breath and give this a moment.
So I did have a question while the typing is continuing, and I don't know if there's an answer to it. I was wondering how, I think for the assessment of whether something is correct, you were basically looking at the document yourself going, would this apply to a real world object? Do you know of any sort of more automated or, at least semi-automated validation tools or methods people could use? I mean, I don't know that they exist, but I thought I'd ask.
There used to be one. I can't remember what it was called. I never used it. Adam Schiff used to use it all the time. I work in the same building as Adam, and he used to use it all the time. And I can't remember what it's called. I can't remember. I don't know how it's used. But
we'll call for Adam Schiff.
It used to tell you if it was a real world object or a web document. I don't know how. I don't know how it did its work. I don't know how it was coded, but somebody had to write the instructions on how to make a determination based on, I'm not sure what. So yeah, but that went away. It did exist, but I know that one tool did disappear. I can't remember what it was called. Does anybody know what that was called?
We're mining everyone's looking. Well, not everyone's. And Christine's looking, and we'll try to put out a message for Adam. Laura does have a question. Christine, I don't know if you want to read it.
sorry, I'm muted. I was about to jump in and ask. I was furiously going through my bookmarks trying to find validation tools that I bookmarked. But Laura asks, can you envision down the road with much cross-linking of data from different sources where using a SCOS concept as an RWO identifier could result in wrong inferences being made when we query data because we will be making OWL same as statements ...
Yeah, that's gonna be like such a nightmare. You know, that's gonna happen all over the place with mixing up of, you know, accusing web documents of agency, you know, accusing real world objects of being documented. I mean, it's just going to be a giant mess. And that was what I was saying. We know there are fine messes ahead, and we're going to have to figure out a way to cope with it because it's not going to be specified away. It's not going away. It's going to be just as part of life. And I think that one of the beauties of linked data is we have so much specificity in what we're describing now. Coming from the era of records, we used to describe lots of things in one record. Now we're describing one thing at a time. We know what entity we're describing. And when we go out and when we start, we can do things like compare and dedupe and with much greater precision now than we could ever do, even though it still stinks, right? It's still not, it was never good to begin with. I mean, we have precision now. And I think maybe there's a chance that we can navigate this problem, but we're not going to be able to best practice it away or specify it away. I think most of the world doesn't even care about RWOs versus web documents distinctions.
I think it stinks, but it could get better is a wonderful note to end on. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So Huda, do you want to play us out?
We are at time. Thank you so much for this presentation. I will most definitely be going back and looking through the slides, and if folks can ask you questions on Slack and continue the conversation. Thank you so much.